I have the Colorful RTX 4070 Battle Axe here with me today to see if the RTX 4070 is truly the best value in ultrawide gaming of the current generation. We'll be comparing it to its big brother, the RTX 4070 Ti, and the RX 7900 XT to see if the savings are worth the performance deficit. Now, let's get into those benchmarks, ultrawide fans.
We are starting off the benchmark with the ray tracing heavy hitter Cyberpunk 2077, tested on its ultra raster and ray trace settings, and using DLSS and FSR quality settings where indicated. Starting off our 3440 by 1440p resolution, we see the RTX 4070 is able to achieve an acceptable average frame rate of 56 FPS for the raster result in this title, well behind the smooth averages seen on the 4070 Ti and the 7900 XTX at 73 and 89 FPS respectively. The 4070 is 22% slower than its Ti sibling, and 33% slower than the Radeon card. In fact, the 7900 XT's 1% low is faster than the 4070's average. Though turning on ray tracing changes the balance of these scales, the RTX 4070 along with the 7900 XT are practically tied at 27 and 26 FPS, down in unplayable frame rate territory, while the 4070 Ti managed to just be unacceptable. When turning on DLSS and FSR, we see the 4070 gets a greater gains in the 7900 XT to get it back to an acceptable frame rate of 51 FPS compared to the 46 of the 7900 XT. The 4070 Ti, however, manages to hit 60 FPS for a smooth gameplay average, making the 4070 15% slower than the Ti, but 11% faster than the XT. Moving on to our 3840 by 1600p resolution, we see the raster results for the RTX 4070 just cling onto acceptable frame rates with a 45 FPS average, while the 4070 Ti just manages to stay in smooth averages with the 7900 XTX at 61 and 75 FPS respectively. We see the 4070's performance slide relative to the tier above, with it now getting 26% slower than the Ti variant and a disappointing 40% slower than the XT. Turning on ray tracing leaves all three cards with a disappointingly unplayable frame rate. With the DLSS and FSR turned on, you see both the 4070 and the 7900 XT with unacceptable frame rates, though the 4070 is a bit ahead with 43 FPS to the XT's 39. The 4070 Ti does manage an acceptable refresh rate of 51 FPS. This puts the 4070 16% behind the Ti, but 10% ahead of the XT. Moving on to our 5120 by 1440p super ultrawide resolution, we see the raster performance fall far into the unacceptable territory with a 37 FPS average. The Ti variant is now only in acceptable range with its average at 52 FPS, and only the 7900 XT can still deliver a smooth 64 FPS average. When ray tracing is turned on, the 4070's performance goes from bad to game breaking, as the built-in benchmark takes over twice as long to chug through as it should. Even the 4070 Ti is seeing some pain in the raw ray tracing results, as its 1% lows falter thanks to its 12 GB of memory. The 700 XT is the only one to gracefully deliver an unplayable performance. When DLSS and FSR are turned on, it fixes the broken nature of the 4070's performance, and it can now deliver console-like performance at this resolution with a 37 FPS average and a 30 FPS 1% low. Still ahead of the 7900 XT, and behind the 4070 Ti though, are all in unacceptable range now, making the 4070 16% slower than the Ti and 9% faster than the XT. At our final resolution of 5120 by 2160p, a pretty unfair resolution to be testing this card at if I'm being honest. As you can see, none of our test conditions allow the 4070 to get out of unplayable range, though the DLS results get close at 25 FPS. The Ti and XT fare a little better, only able to get into unacceptable range. When we compare raster results, we see the 4070 at 32% behind the Ti variant and 47% slower than the XT. With ray tracing plus DLSS and FSR, we see the 4070 tie the 7900 XT, while being 22% slower than the 4070 Ti. For Cyberpunk 2077, the RTX 4070 comes across as more of a 3440 by 1440p high settings card rather than an ultra settings one. Moving on to the recently released Star Wars Jedi Survivor, we are using the intro sequence, testing its epic quality settings and using FSR quality where indicated. Starting off with a 3440 by 1440p resolution, we see the RTX 4070 falling short of 60 with a 53 FPS average, while both the Ti variant and the 7900 XT are getting smooth frame rates of 70 and 65 FPS respectively. We will get into the XT's 1% low issues later on, don't worry. This makes the 4070 20% slower than the Ti and 18% slower than the XT. When ray tracing is turned on, there is only a minor hit in performance to the 4070, allowing it to stay in acceptable performance range with a 47 FPS average, losing out to the Ti, which manages 60 FPS, but beating the XT, which is getting 42 FPS. When FSR is used, we see great results for the 4070, getting a smooth 68 FPS. The Ti also gets a great performance, improving boosts up to 84 FPS, but the 7900 XT hardly gets anything from its own tech and ends up at only 46 FPS, making the 4070 19% slower than the Ti and 49% faster than the XT. Okay, now we can talk about the 7900 XT's 1% lows. First off, they are unreasonably terrible. I tested the Nvidia cards first in the beginning sequence, which is notoriously the hardest part to run of the game, but tailor-made for being a benchmark pass. At launch, the whole first world had issues with performance. Well, everything went fine with the Nvidia card, so I assumed all had been fixed, but apparently AMD didn't get that memo. The funny thing is, the in-game cutscene directly before the active gameplay walking sequence gets great performance. Now, averages can't be compared since scenes are showing completely different things, but 1% lows are at a respectable level, and the FSR performance is working correctly. This happens every time you go in and out of the in-engine cutscene during the early part of the game. Despite this being one of the most anticipated games of the year, I've had zero time to play it, and was not able to push to the second world to verify if it's problem-free as many claim. After the first mission on Coruscant is done, the 1% lows improve for the next section, but FSR is still broken. Maybe I can push further before my next video and give a performance result that will be more indicative of the majority of one's playtime. A new AMD driver did come out right before publishing this video that did increase the averages and took the 1% lows from terrible to merely poor, but didn't fix the RT and FSR performance issue. Sadly, there wasn't time to get those results graphed and in this video. With all that said, let's move on to the next resolution of 3840 by 1600, where we see the 4070 getting only 43 FPS for its raster performance. The Ti variant is managing 57 FPS and the 7900 XT is getting 54 FPS, making the 4070 25% slower than the Ti and 20% slower than the XT. With ray tracing on, the 4070 and the 7900 XT are tied at around 40 FPS, while the 4070 Ti has a decent lead at 50 FPS. When FSR is turned on, the 4070 is able to achieve 62 FPS, though with a disappointing 1% low figure of 38 FPS. The 4070 Ti is getting a smooth 75 FPS, and the 7900 XT is floundering with only 44 FPS, making the 4070 17% slower than the Ti and 41% faster than the 7900 XT. Moving up to the Super Ultrawide 5120 by 1440p resolution, we see a poor raster performance from the 4070 at 38 FPS, with the Ti variant and the 7900 XT scraping by an acceptable range, making the 4070 22% slower than the Ti and 16% slower than the XT. When ray tracing is turned on, all three are given an unacceptable performance. With FSR, the 4070 manages an acceptable performance of 56 FPS, but still suffering from some variable 1% lows, while the Ti manages a solid 69 FPS, and the 7900 XT is scraping along at 42 FPS, making the 4070 18% slower than the Ti and 33% faster than the XT. And finally, our massive 5120 by 2160p resolution sees the RTX 4070 with a measly 25 FPS for its raster result. The Ti and the 7900 XT aren't looking like fine art at only 33 and 34 FPS, making the 4070 24% slower than the Ti and 26% slower than the XT. With ray tracing turned on, only the 7900 Ti managed to even hit 30 FPS. With the FSR on, the 4070 and 7900 XT are both at 41 FPS, stuck in unacceptable range, while the 4070 Ti manages a 52 FPS average. making the 4070 21% slower than the Ti and equivalent to the XT. Star Wars Jedi Survivor is another game where the 4070 falls short of getting its raster performance above 60 FPS at the most common resolution of 3440 by 1440. Thanks to the low ray tracing demands, when FSR is turned on, it can clear the 60 mark while keeping its 1% lows above 45 for a pretty decent gameplay experience. Next up, we have one of the OG ray tracing games and a benchmarking stalwart, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, played on its highest preset, and DLSS and XeSS quality settings used when indicated. Looking at the 3440 by 1440p results, we see the RTX 4070 achieves very high refresh rates at 121 FPS, with the Ti variant getting hardly any more performance at 128 FPS, leaving the 700 XT to lead at 153 FPS, making the 4070 only 5% slower than the Ti and 21% slower than the XT. With ray tracing turned on, the 4070 is still delivering a smooth gameplay experience. Even its 1% lows are over 60, while the Ti and XT are quite evenly matched with high refresh rates of 92 and 90 FPS respectively. When we turn on the, at this resolution, completely unnecessary DLSS and XeSS, we see the 4070 with high refresh rates of 114 FPS, and the Ti variant is back to 128 FPS, while the 700 XT is getting almost no benefit from XeSS with a high refresh rate of 95 FPS, making the 4070 11% slower than the Ti and 20% faster than the XT. Moving up to 3840 by 1600 resolution, we see the 4070 getting 101 FPS, with the Ti variant coming in at 110 FPS and the 700 XT at 132 FPS, making the 4070 8% slower than the Ti and 23% slower than the XT. With ray tracing on the 4070 maintaining a smooth refresh rate of 69 FPS, not far behind the Ti and XT, who are both getting 78 FPS. With DLSS and XeSS turned on, we see the 4070 in high refresh rates with 99 FPS, and the Ti is up at 113 FPS, while the XT struggles with Intel's tech at 83 FPS, making the 4070 12% slower than the Ti and 19% faster than the XT. Moving on to our super ultra-wide resolution of 5120 by 1440, we see the RTX 4070 deliver a smooth 85 FPS raster performance to the high refresh rate performances of the Ti and XT at 95 and 113 FPS respectively, making the 4070 11% slower than the Ti and 25% slower than the XT. With ray tracing on, we see the 4070 barely miss out on 60 FPS, while the two more expensive cards maintain a smooth refresh rate. With DLSS and XeSS on, we see the 4070 at best its raster performance with an 86 FPS average, and the Ti hits 100 FPS, but again, XeSS does little for the XT, delivering only 72 FPS, making the 4070 14% slower than the Ti and 19% faster than the XT. Last is our 5120 by 2160p resolution, where we see the RTX 4070 stay above 60. Both the Ti and XT are in smooth refresh rates as well, making the 4070 9% slower than the Ti and 24% slower than the XT. With ray tracing on, we see the 4070 drop down to 42 FPS, while the other two more expensive cards are tied at 47 FPS. When DLSS and XeSS are deployed, we see a smooth 66 FPS for the 4070, while the Ti is getting 77 FPS. But again, the 700 XT struggles with XeSS and only sees 54 FPS, making the 4070 14% slower than the Ti and 22% faster than the XT. The 4070 puts in a good showing in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, sticking close to the more expensive Ti variant and performing well in Raster and RT up and down the stack. Next up, we have Forza Horizon 5, played on its extreme preset with extreme ray tracing and DLSS and FSR quality where indicated. This game has seen some substantial performance increases for both Nvidia and AMD. Starting with the 3440 by 1440p results, we see the 4070 deliver high refresh rates of 106 FPS, while the Ti variant manages 128 FPS, and the 7900 XT gets 116 FPS, making the 4070 17% slower than the Ti and 9% slower than the XT. When we turn on ray tracing, not much changes for all three GPUs, with the 4070 now getting 99 FPS, the Ti getting 118, and the XT 112 FPS. And with DLSS and FSR turned on, they all creep slightly closer to Raster performance, with the 4070 getting 105 FPS, the Ti at 123 FPS, and the XT at 111 FPS, making the 4070 15% slower than the Ti and 5% slower than the XT, though with better 1% lows. Moving up to 3840 by 1600, we still see high refresh rates for the 4070 of 97 FPS, with the Ti and XT getting 116 FPS, making the 4070 16% slower than the two pricier cards. Turning on ray tracing again sees a marginal drop in performance to 91 FPS for the 4070, and 109 FPS for the Ti, and 108 FPS for the XT. Turning on DLSS and FSR marks a return to Raster performance for both Nvidia cards, and no real improvement for the XT, making the 4070 16% slower than the Ti and 11% slower than the XT. Next, we have our super ultrawide 5120 by 1440p resolution, where we see the 4070 with a smooth refresh rate of 88 FPS. The Ti and XT are coming in with 107 FPS, making the 4070 18% slower than both cards. Ray tracing reduces all GPU performance minimally, the 4070 getting 83 FPS, and the Ti and XT once again tied at 100 FPS. Turning on DLSS and FSR gets the 4070 back to high refresh rate at 90 FPS. The Ti gets to 106 FPS and the XT to 104 FPS, making the 4070 15% slower than the Ti and 13% slower than the XT. At 5120 by 2160p ultrawide resolution, we see the 4070 still producing great frame rates of 73 FPS for the Raster performance, with the Ti getting 88 FPS and the XT 95 FPS, making the 4070 17% slower than the Ti and 23% slower than the XT. When ray tracing is turned on, we see the 4070 gets 67 FPS, the Ti gets 82 FPS, and the XT gets 86 FPS. With DLSS and FSR activated, we see the 4070 now is 74 FPS, the Ti gets a substantial increase to 101 FPS, and the XT finally sees a decent increase with 92 FPS, making the 4070 27% slower than the Ti, and now only 22% slower than the XT. The RTX 4070 again manages to have a good showing at all resolutions, and has a favorable performance differential against both more expensive cards, though it does lose significant ground against them at the 5K by 2K resolution, but this card was never designed to compete there in the first place. The 4070 even manages to have higher 1% lows than the 7900 XT for most resolutions, thanks to the XT's driver being CPU limited. Next up, we have another 2023 title, Forspoken, played on its ultra settings, with FSR and DLSS quality used where indicated. Starting off with a 3440 by 1440p resolution, we see the RTX 4070 getting an acceptable 55 FPS performance, compared to only a slightly faster 58 FPS for the Ti, and with the 7900 XT just making it to 60 FPS, making the 4070 5% slower than the Ti and 8% slower than the XT. When we turn on ray tracing, there isn't much performance loss across the board, with all cards in acceptable range. The 4070 at 48 FPS, the Ti at 52 FPS, and the XT at 51 FPS. With DLSS and FSR turned on, we see better than Raster performance from all cards, with them all getting smooth frame rates, with the 4070 at 64 FPS and the Ti and XT tied at 70 FPS, making the 4070 only 9% slower than the two more expensive cards. Next up, we have the 3840 by 1600p resolution, where we see the RTX 4070 deliver 48 FPS for its Raster performance, with the Ti 2 FPS faster at 50 FPS, and the 7900 XT with 53 FPS, making the 4070 4% slower than the Ti and 9% slower than the XT. Turning on ray tracing drops the 4070 into unacceptable territory with a 41 FPS average, while the Ti and XT are tied at 45 FPS. When DLSS and FSR are turned on, the 4070 falls short of 60 at only 58 FPS, while again the two more expensive cards are tied at 63 FPS, making the 4070 8% slower than both. Next, we will look at the Super Ultrawide 5120 by 1440p resolution, where the 4070 is only capable of 41 FPS for its raster performance, with the Ti and XT not much better at 45 and 44 FPS respectively, making the 4070 9% slower than the Ti and 7% slower than the XT. When ray tracing is turned on, all three cards are in the red, with the 4070 with 36 FPS, the Ti with 40 FPS, and the XT with 38 FPS. With DLSS and FSR turned on, we see a return to acceptable frame rates, with the 4070 getting 50 FPS, the Ti getting 56 FPS, and the XT getting 55 FPS, making the 4070 11% slower than the Ti and 9% slower than the XT. Finally, we have our penultimate resolution, the 5120 by 2160p ultrawide resolution, where the RTX 4070 and frankly the Ti and XT don't stand a chance, with raster performance only 33, 35, and 35 FPS respectively, making the 4070 6% slower than the two more expensive cards. With ray tracing on, this slows down even more, with 27 FPS for the 4070, 30 for the Ti, and 29 FPS for the XT. Though here we do see both 12GB cards lose texture detail, leaving the 7900 XT as the only card that can render the full resolution textures. This issue carries through to the DLSS and FSR results, where we see the 4070 get 41 FPS, and the Ti get 49 FPS, and the XT get 46 FPS, making the 4070 16% slower than the Ti and 11% slower than the XT, and also having worse visuals. This is another modern title where the RTX 4070 is falling short of 60 FPS at 3440 by 1440 with raster performance, but squeaking by with DLSS and ray tracing due to the low ray tracing demands. This is after some pretty significant performance improvements from patches. Even stepping up one more resolution has the 4070 failed to hit 60 even with DLSS, and the performance at even higher resolutions makes the low VRAM issue a moot point, as raw performance isn't there in the first place. As far as comparative performance went, it stuck quite close to the more expensive cards. The last of our ray tracing games is Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, played on its ultra settings with DLSS and FSR quality on where indicated. Starting out at the 3440 by 1400p resolution, we see the RTX 4070 with very high refresh rates of 30 FPS for the raster performance, with the Ti variant achieving 154 FPS and the 7900 XT getting 149 FPS, making the 4070 16% slower than the Ti and 13% slower than the XT. With ray tracing turned on, all three cards end up in smooth frame rate territory, with the 4070 getting 66 FPS, the Ti getting 78 FPS, and the XT getting 60 FPS. With DLSS and FSR turned on, the 4070 jumps up to higher refresh rates at 101 FPS. The Ti is back into very high refresh rates at 125 FPS, and the XT is still in smooth refresh rates at 82 FPS, making the 4070 19% slower than the Ti and 23% faster than the XT. Moving up to our 3840 by 1600p resolution, we see the RTX 4070 delivering higher refresh rates of 110 FPS. The Ti is getting 133 FPS, and the 700 XT is at 131 FPS, making the 4070 17% slower than the Ti and 16% slower than the XT. Turning on ray tracing sees the 4070 fall below smooth range at 56 FPS average, and we see the Ti get 66 FPS, and the XT only at 51 FPS. Turning on DLSS and FSR see the RTX 4070 back up to a respectable 88 FPS, while the Ti gets 108 FPS and the XT gets 70 FPS, making the 4070 19% slower than the Ti and 26% faster than the XT. At the super ultrawide resolution of 5120 by 1440p, the 4070 is getting 94 FPS for the raster performance, with the Ti variant getting 113 FPS and the 7900 XT getting 108 FPS, making the 4070 17% slower than the Ti and 13% slower than the XT. Turning on ray tracing drops the 4070 to 47 FPS, the Ti to 55 FPS, and the XT to 40 FPS, Turning on DLSS and FSR sees the 4070 back in smooth range with 75 FPS, while the Ti gets 92 FPS and the XT at only 59 FPS, making the 4070 18% slower than the Ti and 27% faster than the XT. At our largest resolution of 5120 by 2160, we see the RTX 4070 hang on to smooth frame rates with a 69 FPS average. The Ti model is getting 83 FPS and the 7900 XT is getting 84 FPS, making the 4070 17% slower than the Ti and 18% behind the XT. When turning on ray tracing, all cards are in the red, with the 4070 at 34 FPS, the Ti at 39, and the XT at 31 FPS. With DLSS and FSR turned on, the 4070 almost makes it back to smooth range, but just falls short with a 57 FPS average. The Ti gets 70 FPS, and the XT gets 47 FPS, making the 4070 90% slower than the Ti and 21% faster than the XT. The 4070 managed some very good overall performance in this game, and never strays too far behind the 4070 Ti. Next up we have the first of our Raster only games, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, played on its ultra high preset. At 3440 by 1440, the RTX 4070 is delivering a smooth 86 FPS, with the Ti variant getting 98 FPS and the 7900 XT getting 109 FPS, making the 4070 12% slower than the Ti and 21% slower than the XT. Moving up we have the 3840 by 1600p resolution, where the RTX 4070 delivers a 76 FPS average, with the Ti also delivering a smooth frame rate at 87 FPS, and the 700 XT with high frame rates of 95 FPS, making the 4070 13% slower than the Ti and 21% slower than the XT. Next we have our super ultrawide resolution of 5120 by 1440, where the 4070 is still delivering a solid mid-60s performance, coming in at 66 FPS, with the Ti delivering 76 FPS and the 700 XT getting 82 FPS, making the 4070 13% slower than the Ti and 20% slower than the XT. Lastly, we have our 5120 by 2160 resolution, and at this many pixels the 4070 really doesn't stand much of a chance, with a massive hit to performance bringing it to only 45 FPS, while the Ti just misses out on 60 at 59 FPS, and the 7900 XT just hangs on to smooth gameplay with a 64 FPS average, making the 4070 24% slower than the Ti and 30% slower than the XT. The 4070 has a good showing in this game until it hits the 5K 2K resolution, where it just falls apart compared to the more expensive cards, though I would not knock it for not being able to do something it was never intended for. Next up is Horizon Zero Dawn, played on its ultimate quality preset. First up we have the 3440 by 1440 resolution, where the 4070 gets a nice 101 FPS average, with the Ti getting 115 FPS and the 700 XT getting 116 FPS, making the 4070 12% slower than the Ti and 13% slower than the XT. Moving up to 3840 by 1600, we see the 4070 getting 77 FPS, while the Ti is getting 93 FPS and the XT is hitting 102 FPS, making the 4070 17% slower than the Ti and 25% slower than the XT. At the super ultrawide resolution of 5120 by 1440, where we see the 4070 cling to 60 FPS, while the Ti variant gets 83 FPS and the 700 XT gets 89 FPS, making the 4070 28% slower than the Ti and 33% slower than the XT. At the last resolution of 5120 by 2160, we see the RTX 4070 with a 50 FPS average. Here we see the Ti barely faster at 54 FPS and the 7900 XT at 66 FPS, making the 4070 7% slower than the Ti and 24% slower than the XT. The RTX 4070 gives a solid performance, though its relative performance does shift about, where it loses ground to the other cards as the resolution climbs, until it seems the 4070 Ti hits a memory wall at the 5K 2K resolution. The next game is Borderlands 3, played on its badass preset. At 3440 by 1440, the RTX 4070 is getting a smooth 78 FPS, while the pricier cards are in higher refresh rates, with the Ti getting 101 FPS and the 7900 XT getting 104 FPS, making the 4070 23% slower than the Ti and 25% slower than the XT. Moving up to 3840 by 1600, we see all three cards in smooth gameplay range, with the 4070 getting 69 FPS, the Ti getting 86 FPS, and the 7900 XT getting 89 FPS, making the 4070 20% slower than the Ti and 22% slower than the XT. Taking things to the Super Ultrawide 5120 by 1440 resolution, we see the 4070 fall below 60 with a 57 FPS average, while the Ti is getting 73 FPS and the XT is getting 75 FPS, making the 4070 22% slower than the Ti and 24% slower than the XT. Lastly, we have the massive 5120 by 2160 resolution, where we again see the 4070 take a big hit, with it only producing 31 FPS, while the Ti is getting 53 FPS and the 7900 XT is getting 55 FPS, making the 4070 42% slower than the Ti and 40% slower than the XT. The 4070 does fine in the lower resolutions and stays at a reasonable relative performance to other two cards, but if you take the resolution much higher, you start getting into trouble, and there's no DLSS here to save your bacon. Next up is Total War Warhammer 3 played on its Ultra preset using the battle simulation. Starting with 3440 by 1440p, we see the RTX 4070 delivering 67 FPS, while the Ti variant is getting 75 FPS, and the 7900 XT is getting 84 FPS, making the 4070 11% slower than the Ti and 20% slower than the XT. Moving up to the 3840 by 1600p resolution, we see the 4070 slip below 60 with a 57 FPS average, with the Ti getting 65 FPS and the 7900 XT getting 71 FPS, making the 4070 12% slower than the Ti and 20% slower than the XT. At the Super Ultrawide resolution of 5120 by 1440p, we see the 4070 getting 50 FPS, the Ti getting 56 FPS, and the 7900 XT getting 62 FPS, making the 4070 11% slower than the Ti and 19% slower than the XT. At the final resolution of 5120 by 2160, we see the RTX 4070 down at 36 FPS, with the Ti getting 40 FPS and the 7900 XT getting 45 FPS, making the 4070 12% slower than the Ti and 20% slower than the XT. The RTX 4070's performance in Total War Warhammer 3 is pretty low, making only the lowest resolution really viable unless you turn down the settings, since there's no DLSS in this game. But the relative performance, especially to the Ti, is quite strong. Lastly, we have Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Extraction, played on its Ultra preset, with resolution quality set to fixed 100%. Starting with a 3440 by 1440p resolution, we see the 4070 with very high refresh rates of 137 FPS, with the Ti variant getting 165 FPS and the 7900 XT 172 FPS, making the 4070 17% slower than the Ti and 20% slower than the XT. Moving up to 3840 by 1600p, we see the 4070 with high refresh rates of 115 FPS, with the Ti variant at 140 FPS and the 7900 XT at 146 FPS, making the 4070 18% slower than the Ti and 21% slower than the XT. At our Super Ultrawide resolution of 5120 by 1440, we see the RTX 4070 hanging on to high refresh rates with a 95 FPS average, to the Ti's 121 FPS and the XT's 124 FPS, making the 4070 21% slower than the Ti and 23% slower than the XT. Jumping to the 5120 by 2160p resolution, we see the 4070 with smooth refresh rates of 69 FPS, and the Ti is delivering 85 FPS, and the 7900 XT 86 FPS, making the 4070 19% slower than the Ti and 20% slower than the XT. Overall performance for the 4070 is good in this game, but the relative performance is on the weaker side of what we have seen in these benchmarks. Now let's take a look at our results and see how the 4070 performs at all of our resolutions. Starting with the most common ultrawide resolution of 3440 by 1440, and starting with our raster results, we see the 4070 has 3 games with very high refresh rates, 2 games with high refresh rates, 3 more in smooth refresh rates, and our 2 2023 games plus Cyberpunk failing to hit 60 and coming in with acceptable refresh rates. When we look at the 1% lows, we see that 5 of the 11 games are above 60 FPS and 6 of the 11 games are below 60 FPS, making the raster performance for the RTX 4070 more of a 3440 by 1440p high card rather than an ultra card, or alternatively you can look at it as an ultra with DLSS card. When we check out the ray tracing results, we see 1 high refresh rate game, 2 smooth games, and 2 games with acceptable and 1 unplayable. With DLSS quality on, things start to look better with 3 high refresh rate games, 2 smooth games, and 1 acceptable performance. The 1% lows see half the games above 60 and half below, cementing this card's status as an ultra settings card as long as DLSS is used, though it still won't be enough on its own to get a good Cyberpunk ray tracing experience. Moving up in resolution to the 3840 by 1600p resolution, starting with our raster results, we see the 4070 with 4 games in high refresh rates, 3 games in smooth refresh rates, 3 acceptable, and 1 unacceptable refresh rates. And when looking at the 1% lows, 4 of the 11 games are above 60 with the other 7 below. When we check out the ray tracing, we see 1 high refresh rate game, 1 smooth game, 1 acceptable, and 3 unacceptable frame rates. With DLSS quality boosting the performance, we see 2 games with high refresh rates, 2 with smooth, 1 acceptable, and 1 unacceptable frame rate performances. When looking at the 1% lows, we see 3 games stay above 60 and 3 games well below. Now looking at our super ultrawide 5120 by 1440p resolution, we see 2 games with high refresh rates, 4 with smooth refresh rates, 2 with acceptable, and 3 with unacceptable. And when looking at the 1% lows, we see 4 games stay above 60 and 7 dip below. And when ray tracing is turned on, only 1 game has smooth frame rates, 2 have acceptable and 2 unacceptable, and Cyberpunk 2077 is truly unplayable. Once DLSS quality is turned on, we see 1 high refresh rate game, 2 smooth, 2 acceptable, and 1 unacceptable. When looking at the 1% lows, we see 2 games above 60 and 4 below 60. And at our final resolution of 5120 by 2160, we see this card is clearly not intended for this resolution, and I would not recommend this card for this resolution for anyone looking to game. Now, let's talk price to performance. When looking at the raster results, we see the RTX 4070 with a modest price to performance lead at the 3 lower resolutions, with only the 5K by 2K resolution allowing the 7900 XT to squeak by. But this resolution is not even a consideration when talking about cards at this performance level, so it's a meaningless loss. If you're looking at raster performance, then the 7900 XT is making a decent case for being the upgrade choice you want, only costing you 3.5% more per frame. The raw ray tracing performance, though, puts the 4070 squarely in the lead for value, and turning on upscaling only further reinforces that, leaving only the 4070 Ti as a viable upgrade choice for the RT enthusiast, but at an 11% extra cost per frame.
While the RTX 4070 is the best price to performance card, I can only recommend it for the 3440 by 1440p resolution. And even then, with more modern titles, it's more of a 1440p high settings card, or Ultra plus DLSS card than a true Ultra card. And I would not go beyond 3840 by 1600p if your primary intent was gaming. Even then, that's a bit of a stretch. And 5120 by 1440 super ultrawide resolution is just too much resolution for this card, and forget about going to 5120 by 2160 ultrawide. I know there are some of you out there that are saying, with frame generation, this 4070 can play at that super ultrawide resolution. But while frame generation is coming out on more and more games, seemingly every day, it's not on everything yet. And if you're relying on it for a decent frame rate, you're going to be disappointed when a game like the upcoming Starfield comes out and doesn't have it, and it will crush your FPS dreams. And it's not suitable for every situation. Of the 2 games that we have in our test suite, only one is really perfectly suitable for using frame generation, and that's Forza Horizon 5, which is already getting a 90 FPS average when ray tracing and using DLSS quality, which is a damn fine play experience on its own. But you can turn on frame generation and get an ultra silky smooth experience if you have a 240Hz monitor without really sacrificing any visual quality. And you'll still get the latency of someone playing at 45Hz. On the other side of the coin is a game like Cyberpunk 2077, where you're only getting 37 FPS when ultra ray tracing and DLSS quality are on. This is a low enough frame rate that you'll be able to see all the artifacts of a frame generated frame. And when your brain goes to blend the sharp frame from the game engine with a frame generated frame, it's going to overall present you with a blurry, soft image. And you'll be playing at what's equivalent to an 18 FPS latency, which isn't ideal. You really need to have around 60 FPS if you want to have a decent experience with frame generation, where your brain can ignore most of the artifacts. Even then, more frame rate is better. It seems like all I hear about is frame generation, and no one else is excited for Nvidia's DLAA technology, a technology that gives you actual better than native visuals. Of course, this means you need to be able to render the native resolution at a frame rate you can accept, but the results speak for themselves. But it seems that many of you are guilty of a crime I myself have committed several times, which is buying more monitor than your GPU budget can allow you to run. With all that said, it's easy to find a version of the RTX 4070 at its MSR price of $600. So, TLDR, should you get the RTX 4070 or not? If you're running an older 3440 by 1440p monitor that maxes out at 100 Hz or maybe even overclocks to 120, or you have an even older 1080p Super Ultrawide or Ultrawide monitor, then I think the RTX 4070 is going to be just fine for you. If you have a newer 3440 by 1440p monitor that is 144 Hz plus, or you're running a 3840 by 1600 or higher resolution, then I really recommend you get a more performant GPU.
Everything was tested on my test bench featuring an AMD R7 5800X 3D with 32GB of 3200Hz CL14 memory on Windows 11 running the latest AMD and Nvidia drivers.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoy Ultrawide content, please like and subscribe to get even more Ultrawide news and reviews. If you decide that this card isn't quite fast enough for you, please check out one of my other videos from either Team Green or Team Red, where you can see some of the faster cards tested. Now, if I've helped you make a buying decision and you want to show this channel some love, you can either use one of the Amazon affiliate links in the description below, sign up to my Patreon, or even hit me up with a super. I just want to thank all my patrons and all of you for watching. I'm Scott, and I'll see you next time, Ultrawide fans.